Hi, my name is Jean Levinson Duitch. I was born on July 31st, 1930, to Matt and Ethel Levinson. I was born here in Omaha and actually have lived in Omaha almost my entire life. I went to Dundee grade school, which in those days we went from kindergarten through grade 8. I went to Central High, and then I graduated from what was then Omaha University, but now is UNO. So I guess I'm as much of a native Omahan as you're ever going to find anywhere. My parents lived at 4819 Farnham, and that was a really wonderful place to live when Bethel Synagogue decided to build a synagogue on the corner of 49th and Farnham. I remember my parents just being absolutely elated because we could get to the synagogue in a couple minutes. I was not that thrilled about it because some of the neighborhood kids and I used to play softball on that vacant lot. But later I grew to really appreciate it. We lived there, as was the custom. I lived there until I married Jack Duitch from Spokane, Washington. I think most young people lived at home until they got married. My grandparents were Libalea and Saul Katz. They lived on 24th and Charles in a house that was very famous because it had a blue Magen David on the front of it. People would go by and they always knew that was where the Katzes lived. My grandfather had a hardware store a few doors away on 24th Street, and it was in the hardware store that he and his wife, Libalea, and I never heard her called anything but Libalea, where they spent their time. My family would go there on a Sunday. It was rather traditional. We would stop at the meat markets, and we would stop at the bakeries on 24th Street, and then we would bring back to their house something to make lunch with. At that time, my aunt, Kitty Frank, and her husband, Al Frank, used to also come with their children, Elaine and Muriel, and much later, Lil Dick. We loved those times. They were really great fun. We didn't know anything about cholesterol, and we didn't know a lot about a lot of things. So we ate the cold cuts with great relish. This was our Sunday activity. My grandparents were extraordinarily religious. They had come from Europe when they were in their early 20s, and they brought their children with them, and they moved around a bit until my grandfather realized that there was nowhere he could observe Shabbos except if he had his own store. For a while he worked in Council Bluffs, but the man who owned the hardware store insisted that he work on Shabbos. And my grandfather said, no way. So they came to Omaha, and they lived in this almost like a shtetl where all the shop owners were Jewish, and all the shops were closed on Shabbos, and Sunday was the very big day. My grandparents lived in that place until 1950, about 1950. And when the State of Israel was declared in 1948, my grandparents immediately decided that they would move to what my grandmother called Eretz Yisrael. And they wanted to be there, to die there. to be sure that they were buried in the Holy Land. It was sort of a strange feeling for me because I had never seen anyone sew their own shrouds before, but my grandmother did it, and they had property in Omaha. The source of their money was actually the big tornado. I think it was, Ben, do you remember 1908 or 9? Something like that. And at that time, there was a huge tornado that ripped through Omaha. Their store was left standing, and they stayed open until they sold out of every single thing they had, nails, wood, whatever it was. So that was how they got their stake, and they invested it in real estate, property close by, because that was the one thing they couldn't do in Europe. They couldn't own any land. So my grandparents sold off all their property, and they packed their bags, and in 1950, they left Omaha, much to everyone's shock. They had lived in Omaha over 50 years, and they were leaving their entire family, all their children, their grandchildren. They were leaving everybody because they wanted to go to Israel to die. It was very interesting at the time, and I remember my mother and my Aunt Kitty Frank saying, "Can you believe this? At this age, they're in their 70s, and they're so old, and they want to go move to Israel." Well, move to Israel they did. And in the beginning, when they first got there, they went to stay with a relative at Kibbutz Afikim. But that was not good because my grandmother was quite sure they had, quote unquote, free love at that kibbutz. And she determined she wanted to live a religious life. So they decided to move to Bnei Brak. Now, some of you are laughing about Bnei Brak because you know it. Bnei Brak is mentioned in the Haggadah of Passover, and everyone in my family pauses when they get to the word Bnei Brak, and we tell the story of my grandparents. Anyway, that's where they went to live. And my grandmother, for the first time in her life, put on a sheitel, a wig. She never wore it quite straight. It was always sort of askew on her head, but that's what she wanted to be religious. My grandfather, in the meantime, because he knew how to use his hands, he helped people in the neighborhood to build a shul. This, when I say help them to build, I mean with his bare hands, wielding a hammer and nails, and they were very busy. My grandpa used to speak English to us in Omaha. My grandmother never did. When you would first see her, it was was machst du, and from there on it went. I was foolish enough at that time to not want to learn Yiddish because I thought it was so old-fashioned. Now I wish that I had learned it. But anyway, my grandparents settled into Bnei Brak, and my grandmother, who never, ever spoke English to us in Omaha, became known as the Amerikaner. Now, that always tickled me when they'd say, you're from the Amerikaner. Yes. When I first got there, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. My grandparents were very, very busy, and they really were not corresponding with their daughters in Omaha. And this was a cause célèbre because you didn't make phone calls in those days. You simply didn't do it. There were maybe 3 telephones in Bnei Brak. One was at the pharmacy, and I'm not sure where the other 2 were. But if you wanted to make a call in those years, you would go to the pharmacy, and tell them that on Sunday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you will be there to receive a call from America. And I mean, it'd be big excitement. People simply did not call back and forth. And the lines were not clear. It was very, very difficult. And I think it was around $5 or $6 a minute. Thank goodness that has changed a lot, along with a lot of other things. But anyway, my grandparents were so busy being the Amerikaners and helping everyone that they didn't have time to write home. So my mother and my aunt decided that someone had to go to Israel to see what was really going on. And I was elected. So when I graduated from college in 1952, I was definitely going to go to Israel, and that was fine with me because I had been raised in such a Zionistic family that I really was dying to go. I would like to backtrack, perhaps, before my trip and tell you that in my growing up, my mother was always very active in the Zionist movement and in any kind of Jewish education that took place in Omaha. My father was a chemist, and he had been born and brought up in Siberia. His father was a physician, and his mother took up dentistry, which was extremely unusual in those days for a woman to do. But she decided if she was going to live in Siberia, she better have something to do. And so they lived in Siberia, and my grandfather, I understand, was an eye doctor and a pediatrician and quite a few other things, because there were not that many physicians where they lived in Siberia. My grandmother saved and translated for us the obituaries that were in the paper when he died at age 46, and he was quite a man. My grandmother, well, I'm getting ahead of myself now, too, so I won't. Anyway, my father had a very, very German-sounding last name. It was sort of a Levensoni with umlauts and all kinds of things. When the storm clouds were gathering in Europe for World War I, he knew that he would be considered a German because of his name, and he thought that he probably better get out of Europe and get to America. He was an excellent student. We have his report cards, his college report cards. In high school, he won medals for his intelligence, and that was why he was allowed to go to university, because I guess most Jewish boys were not able to go to the university. But he had various medals that he had gotten from the government. In later years, I had some of these things translated for me by a lovely lady at the Blumkin home who said to me, "Your father must have been very, very special because these things that you show me are very unusual for a Jewish man." Well, my father decided to go to the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and that's where he went for his first 2 years of college. My father had decided that Scotland should be a safe place for him, and so it was to the University of Glasgow that he went. My grandmother and my grandfather, whom I never ever knew, stayed in Siberia, and my grandfather died at the age of 46 or 47. My father, in the meantime, felt that he really had better get to America. He was into chemistry, and that's what he was studying. So he had heard about Ohio State, and that's where he went. I have a feeling in those days that admittance to schools was more based on your ability to pay than on particular tests that you took. I don't know. But he seemed to have no trouble getting in anywhere. So he was there. At this point, let me go back and tell you a little bit about his mother and father. His mother was born in Riga, Latvia. She was the second in a family of 4 girls. Her father owned a department store there, so they were really, really upper crust. She told me that they, unlike many people, had 3 dresses. Each girl had 3 dresses. One for her best dress to wear on special occasions, one for a school dress, and one for a dress while they weren't doing anything special at home. And my grandmother always thought that my sisters Doris and Judy and me had way too many clothes. Grandmother, to the end of her days, lived in that type of environment. And I remember her saying, after my sister Doris had married Marty Haken, the son of Pauline and Harry Haken, and Pauline was the oldest of the Noggs. Her brothers were in Igo, and Pauline was the oldest. And my grandmother used to say, I don't know why Doris can't find someone to live in, take care of her children, do the cooking and do the laundry, and she should pay them well, at least $2 a week. So it was a little hard for us to try to explain to grandmother that that just wouldn't cut it nowadays. Anyway, my grandmother, in her education, had learned many languages. She was fluent in French and fluent in German and could read English. She didn't quite pronounce words correctly in English, but being the perfectionist that she was, when she came to America, what she did was buy herself children's little books. And she would start reading and see how the words were put together and read and before people so that she could practice on her pronunciation. The way my grandmother got to Omaha is really a story in itself. My father and his mother had lost all contact with each other when the First World War broke out. They would vaguely hear about each other from somebody who was traveling, but my father really didn't know how to get a hold of his mother, and his mother didn't have any idea how to get a hold of him. One day, someone was traveling through Riga, which is where my grandmother had gone after her husband died. She met someone who was traveling through Riga who was from the Midwest in America. And she said to them, please, I've lost contact with my only child. Help me get in contact. And the woman said, well, I wouldn't know anybody named Matthias, but I do know someone in Omaha, Nebraska, who is quite involved in the Jewish scene. And I think if you write her, then she might be able to know where your son is. And of course, the person who had been involved in the Jewish scene was my mother, Ethel Katz, who was already married to my father. And when the letter came, there was tremendous joy in the family. Finally, my father had been reunited with his mother. and of course made plans for her to come to Omaha immediately. This is a story that was told by Rabbi David Goldstein at my father's funeral. It was such a coincidence. By the time my grandmother arrived, my eldest sister, Judy, was already about 2 years old. So that was, she had a wonderful life in Omaha, my grandmother, because she was able to enjoy all three of her granddaughters. Judy was especially close to her because, of course, Judy had been around the entire time. Then 8 years later, Doris came, and then 2 years after that, I was born. We adored our grandmother Levinson. We adored her. First of all, she spoke English to us, unlike Grandma Katz. And with Grandma Levinson, everything was an adventure. We would go lots of places together. In the summertime, we would go on the streetcar. We would make arrangements what time Doris and I would get on the streetcar, and we would wave with a hanky out the back of the streetcar. My grandmother was living at that time on 21st and Leavenworth, and she would watch, and when a streetcar came by and she saw a hanky waving out the back, she got on, and we were reunited. We used to go to the public library at least once every 2 weeks. We used to go to the Jocelyn Museum at least once a month. Some of our favorite things to do was to go to the Jocelyn on the Sunday when Esther Leaf Duboff played the organ. My friends now all think that I'm corny because I love organ music, but I love it because of the memory of those wonderful times at the Jocelyn. We really, grandmother saw to it that we read. She played the piano, and Doris and I used to sing a good deal. We were always doing duets. Later, when I learned how to play the piano, grandmother and I played duets, but I was never very good at it. We had a happy life with her. We didn't know we were poor because we just assumed that everybody was like we were. I do remember for sure that when we got the occasional nickel to go and get ice cream, and it was not a regular treat, we would always buy a popsicle because that could be divided in two, and Doris and I could each have an equal share. I do somehow remember that in those days there was an ice cream cone with 3 cups. And if there was a third friend with us, then that's what we got, and we each ate the ice cream out of our own cup. We were happy. We didn't know any different. I had a great number of friends at Dundee School. And when Bethel was formed, and my parents were among the founders, and it was decided that the first thing that had to happen was there had to be a Talmud Torah. And I see that nowadays people only talk about Hebrew school, but we always talked about Talmud Torah, or TT. And I was in the first class at Bethel Talmud Torah, as was my sister Doris, who was 2 years older, and some of the people in my class that I remember. And if I leave some of you out, forgive me. But it was Marty Thayer, and Mikey Kolakowski, and Al Fox, and Millard Margolin, and Evie Ossoff Rice, and Barbara Blacker, and I'm trying to think who else. We all just walked from Dundee School because our first classes were held at the Humpty Dumpty Nursery School on about 51st and Capitol, something like that, very close to Dundee School. So we all walked over there. There were two who sometimes came late because they had to take a bus. And that was Jerry Cattleman and I'm trying to remember, there were several others. Anyway, we went to Talmatora at the Humpty Dumpty Nursery School. And if you were privileged to know any of the people that I mentioned, you will know that they were very, very active. And when we would come right after grade school, we were always given graham crackers and milk, and then we played on the equipment, the nursery school equipment. And the fellows were constantly breaking chairs and tables, and this was not a really good match. Finally, they had a contract, so they let us stay the first year, but that was absolutely it. Then we couldn't stay anymore. So then they started looking for a place for us to have Talmatora because the synagogue was just not built yet. In those years, Dr. Morris Margolin was the long-standing chairman of Jewish education. And he and my parents and his wife were very, very close friends. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. And one day he came up with the idea that he had a very poor patient by the last name of Sedlacek. And they had a lot of children, and they could use extra income. And they lived in a big house between 49th and 50th on, I think it was Davenport. And that would be a good place for us to meet. Well, those were heady days. By then we had 2 different classes because I was in the class that started and then the class that followed me. That was very, very big. So we all walked over to Sedlacek's house, and we stayed there actually until Bethel was built. And the first part of Bethel that was built was the office, which served as our Talmatora classrooms. But anyway, it was at Sedlacek's that I first smelled something that I had never smelled before. And I found out that it was a form of bacon, and I didn't know what that was. My mother had never taught me what bacon was. So I had a lot of life's learning at that place. We had a very, very good time, those of us who went to Talmatora together, because we were buddies in grade school and we were buddies at Talmatora. Many of the girls my age were not sent to Talmatora. So at the same time, there was a confirmation class. And some of my friends, like Patty Bellman and Sandy Solomon and Audrey Cohn and quite a few others were in that class. As I remember, the only girls that were in Talmatora were Carol Bakovici and my sister Doris and Ruthie Kolakowski, who had the first bat mitzvah at Bethel, I am quite sure, and Evie, as I mentioned before, and Barbara Blacker. So it was a very interesting time. When Bethel finally came up enough for us to have classes there, that was a very interesting experience because each day I would come home, and remember, I lived less than a block away from the synagogue. So I was always schlepping kids home with me, and it was an interesting time in my life. Anyway, my mother would ask the question, "How many of the ceiling tiles fell on your head today, Jean?" And we would recount what happened, who almost got hit, because the building really wasn't ready to be occupied, but we occupied it. Rabbi David Goldstein at that time had his offices next to the balcony, all the way up there. That was a room that I knew about, but a lot of the kids didn't know about. But Doris and I had been climbing the rafters, and I mean, it's quite amazing we didn't get hurt while Bethel was being built, because we really knew the place very, very well. This all went on. I can name you some of my early Hebrew teachers, and none of these names would be familiar, but Naomi Ben Ora, Aaron Saviv, these were people who taught us, and their qualifications were that they knew Hebrew. It's not that they knew how to teach, but they knew Hebrew. In many, many, many later years, my mother maintained a friendship with the Savivs who moved to Jerusalem. And whenever my mother went to Jerusalem, she saw the Savivs. We'll go on now. I can't remember where, I feel like I've left a lot of threads sort of hanging, which I had better tie up now. My father, as I said, was a chemist, and for a while he worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. But then the times were hard, and he was laid off, and they already had a daughter, Judy, and it was recession. It was very, very bad. So he decided that he would open up his own store, which would be a specialty chemical place. And he would sell things, number one, to kill bugs, because that was something that he had worked on when he worked for the Union Pacific. And number two, specialty chemicals that people wanted. One of his first specialty chemicals was what we now know as a detergent. It didn't have that name in those days. People only knew about soap. And my grandmother Katz had wanted some kind of a soap that was kosher, because she needed something to wash her dishes in, and she couldn't use soap. So he invented what is now known as a detergent. There were many things that came following that. If they had had the money to patent things, the family would have been very, very well-to-do. But they really never had the money to patent everything. I remember the story, which was often told. My father and Sam Rice, who started Glandolac, were very close friends, and they were both chemists and both loved to invent things. One time they decided to work on candy, sugarless candy. And this was going to revolutionize the world. And so they worked in one of their labs, I don't know whose, and they finally got a chocolate candy that looked like a regular chocolate, and it wasn't though. And it had very, very few calories in it. So they were very excited, and I had heard the story many times, how they both went home to their families and said, "We've done it, we've done it, we've done it. We finally got a chocolate that doesn't have sugar in it." And when they came back to the lab in the morning, the candies had collapsed. They had filled them with air, but they collapsed, and they never did figure out how to make candy that didn't collapse. They had other adventures. There was the story of when my father and Sam Rice not invented, but made gold. They had figured out how they could make gold, and they decided, they were both poor at the time, that that's what they would do. Well, they finally figured out how to make gold, and then I guess my mother said, "Did you figure out how much electricity you used and what the electricity cost?" And they said no. And when push came to shove, it had cost them more in electric bills than they got out of the gold. So that was another thing that didn't work. By the way, speaking of making money, my grandmother Levinson, who came from Latvia to Omaha, her husband had been extremely well-to-do. He was a physician, and Grandma knew nothing about anything very practical. Grandma could make beautiful desserts, but she couldn't cook a thing. She certainly didn't know anything about money. So when she was leaving Siberia, someone advised her to cash in all the jewels, all the money that she had, and get Russian bonds. Well, that's exactly what she did. And of course, the Russian bonds were worthless. And so when she came to America, she had a few interesting items of silver and gold, but other than that, she had all these bonds that were totally no good. The revolution had come, and the bonds were worthless. My sister Doris, who always had a huge, great imagination, used to tell stories about how we would have been heiresses. If only Grandma had not cashed in everything and put it into jewels, we would have been enormously rich. Well, that was fine for Doris, but I guess it never really bothered me too much. Grandma came to Omaha in about 1922, and she lived here until she died. I think it was like 1959. She was able to know Doris had 3 children by that time, and I had then David and Debbie. And she was able to know that she had grandchildren and had a granddaughter finally, because Debbie was the first granddaughter in the family. Everybody had boys, which we always thought was interesting since we were 3 girls, but we managed to just have boys. So we visited Grandma a great deal. She ended up living at the Dr. Scher home, and at the Dr. Scher home there was a fabulous nurse by the name of Bella Eisenberg, who adored my grandmother, and they could speak to each other in Russian, and Bella was her great savior for many, many years, because she would visit her daily, and she still holds great memories of my grandmother. Now it's time to switch, I think, to my other grandparents. My other grandparents who went to Israel in 1950. No, I have to go back before then. My own father became ill in 1943, and he was ill as his father had been, and he was finally bedridden and died in December of 1943. This was a tough time for us because we were, you know how kids are, they're very, they want to be like everybody else, and nobody else had lost a parent. So it was almost an embarrassment that our father had died. This group of kids that I told you about, who I went to grade school and Tamatura with, all came over, and they brought a big bouquet of flowers. Flowers weren't done in those days, and I remember my mother saying, "Flowers, flowers, what Jew brings flowers?" But Rose Margolin, her good friend, said to her, "It's the Kinderlach. They wanted to bring flowers." And actually, I thought that was very, very nice. So I was in 8th grade, and my father died. My sister was a sophomore at Central, and my oldest sister, Judy, had by then married her husband, Paul Rubenstein Rustin, and he was in the Army, and they were stationed in Topeka, Kansas. My sister, Judy, later had 2 children, both boys, Robert Matthew, the first person to be named after my father, and Charles. They're both alive today, and they live in Boulder, Colorado. I keep up with them very, very closely. My sister Judy, at 87, is in a retirement home, and she seems to be doing extremely well. She is as sharp as she's ever been, but physically she begins to fade a little bit. Our sister Doris died at the age of 66 from ovarian cancer. It is interesting to know that we now know there are genes that you can have which carry ovarian cancer. But at the time, nobody knew that. And Doris used to say, "How come I got ovarian cancer? How did I get ovarian?" Doris was always a health nut. Doris walked miles and miles and never put anything in her mouth that wasn't extremely healthy. I wish she had been able to know that it had nothing to do with anything she did, that it was simply her genes. Doris and Marty had 5 children, 4 boys, and a daughter, Jenny, named after Grandma Jenny Levinson. I try to keep up with them as closely as I can. And recently, this last August, I went to Portland, Oregon, where Doris's middle boy, Jim, lives, and I attended his daughter's bat mitzvah. All the boys and Jenny were there, except for Steve. Steve is with USAID, and at that point he was in Kenya as the chief officer there. Now I think he's in the Congo. Steve and I talk by phone or we email, but it was wonderful for me to see the other kids and their children, and Marty, of course, was there, and we really had a very, very nice time together. I'd like to go back now to a thread that I kind of left hanging. I told you that when I graduated from college, my grandparents had already been in Israel for 2 years, and I was delegated to go to see how they were doing. Well, it was most interesting because people really weren't going to Europe or going to Israel in 1952. This was too soon after the war. My grandparents were so thrilled that I was coming, and they had lots and lots of requests to make of me. So I had to come with a huge steamer trunk. My grandfather missed his strawberry jam, and my grandmother, for whatever reason, insisted that I bring many, many percale white sheets. And she said, make sure they're 100% percale and they're white, and bring the sheets. So we had no idea what Grandma wanted the sheets for. Figured maybe she wanted it for wedding presents or something, no idea. Anyway, I went through Europe first, and my Grandma Levinston had a most favorite nephew, Sasha. And Sasha was the only person from her family that she knew who had made it through the war years. So I was scheduled to meet Sasha and his wife, Loya. They had been corresponding with my grandmother ever since they found each other, and this was to be an absolute grand reunion. But I wanted to see Paris, and they were on holiday in the Pyrenees. So it was agreed that a friend of theirs would meet me. I went by ship. I went on the SS United States on its first regular voyage, not the maiden voyage, but the first regular voyage, and that he would show me around Paris. By the way, since it was the first regular sailing, the people who worked on the ship weren't even sure which class people were in. And I was young, and Charlotte Rich, who many of you may remember, had an uncle going on the same trip. Her uncle had arranged for me to spend a good deal of time in first class. And that was fine with me. And it was a wonderful voyage. When I got the boat train and got to Paris, I saw a man with a red carnation and a red book. This was my grandmother, all in all. She was very dramatic, and she knew that if the person who was meeting me would wear a red carnation and carry a red book, everything would be fine. So I met him. He spoke no English. I spoke Mademoiselle Bozel's French, which was absolutely nothing. I didn't speak Yiddish. He could speak Yiddish. And he really didn't know English. So at first we thought this was going to be really kind of an interesting adventure. As it turned out, he had a daughter who lived in Israel, and his Hebrew was about equal to my Hebrew, which wasn't great, but it was enough to get us by. I spent about 5 days in Paris with him, and we went everywhere. He knew the Louvre very, very well because his wife had been a sculptress and had shown work and worked there. And we went to the Paris Opera, and we did all kinds of wonderful things. Now, I assumed that the relative Sasha would be like his friend. Anyway, I finally got on the train to go down to the Pyrenees. And when I got off at the agreed-upon station, I saw an older man who looked so much like my grandmother that there was no question that was Sasha. And I was thrilled to death. But Sasha and his wife Loya knew no English. Sasha knew English to read. But as he used to say, I pronounce it to myself differently than you say it. And he, for example, would mention a fork and a spoon and a knife. And I was a knife. Well, isn't that how you pronounce Knife? And so we hit it off but it was tough really communicating with them. He took me to Lourdes, and at Lourdes I was just absolutely fascinated by the number of people who were there, and the fact that they were throwing aside their crutches and canes and really supposedly they were healed. Anyway, we did all that, and then I already had a reservation on a Zim ship. It was either the Arza or the Negba, and I can't remember which one. But those were the two ships that Zim operated the Israel shipping line. Now, Israel knew about as much about operating a ocean vessel as the man in the moon, because there was no history, no anything. And anyway, I was to take the boat on a particular day. I say boat because it really wasn't much more than a boat, but it was a ship. And I had to travel to Marseille, I think, to get on the ship. I think it was Marseille. Anyway, the ship was to dock, and we were to get on around noon. I walked down, and I was told no, the ship would not be going at noon. And then I came back, and at 1 o'clock, the ship would not be going at 1 o'clock. And then the next time I came down, I saw huge crowds of people with very, very colorful clothing on and carrying their possessions in a knapsack, and very dark people. And it turned out that they had been waiting for the Yemenites to show up to get on the ship. Now, these were people that the Jewish agency was bringing to Israel, and they were not like any Jew I have ever met before, but they got on the ship and they all went below deck. And I realized that they were not being treated terribly well. I got on the ship, and you understand this is a very small ship, and all the sailors were Israelis. And none of the sailors knew what they were doing, and none of them came from any kind of a background of shipping. But these people were kept below deck, while those of us who were traveling regular class stayed up on deck. I was quite lucky because there was a group from the Baltimore Hebrew Teachers Academy or something that was on the ship. So I had a lot of young people my age, and I became very friendly with these people so that I could, later I visited with them in Israel. Anyway, we got to Israel. It took 5 days to get to Israel on this ship, and we landed in Haifa Bay. At Haifa Bay, we picked up whatever luggage we could carry, I guess, and I then went to my grandparents in Bnei Brak. A few days later, I received a postcard that my big steamer trunk could be picked up. So I went to Haifa by bus. Everybody did everything on a bus in those days. People carried their chickens. They carried everything with them on the bus. And the bus, as I remember writing home to my mother, was the bus that I remembered Peony Park using when they went from 72nd, the end of the bus line in those days, to Peony Park. It was falling apart. It was just awful, but that was the buses that they had at the time. Anyway, I went to Haifa Bay, and I had to get my trunk out. I was really, really embarrassed because the people had gone through the trunk and they asked me, why was I carrying so many sheets? And then they winked and winked and indicated, was I looking for a husband in Israel and I wanted to set up housekeeping? And I said, no, but I didn't know why I was carrying the sheets. Anyway, I got everything back to B'nai Brak. And B'nai Brak, for those of you who don't know, it's really like a suburb of Tel Aviv. When I got the steamer trunk back to my grandparents' house, and please know that they built the apartment building that they were living in, and Grandma wouldn't be on the first floor because there was too much sand would get in, and in those days there was sand everywhere. Anyway, I got my steamer trunk upstairs, opened it up, and I said, Grandma, here are the sheets that you asked for. And to my utter amazement, my grandmother started tearing them up. I said, Grandma, why are you tearing up the sheets? She says, why am I tearing up the sheets? Because they don't have diapers here, and I want to give diapers to the people who need them. I said, why didn't you tell me? They make diapers now. What do you mean they make diapers now? Grandma, they sell diapers the right size. Well, I didn't know that. And so she proceeded to take all these gorgeous percale sheets and tear them up. I guess I did forget to tell you that when you opened the refrigerator at the grandparents', and theirs was a prototype of how apartments were in Israel at that time. You walked into a room that was the kitchen and the dining room, and it was everything. And there was their American refrigerator. The top shelf, that belonged to Mrs. Rosenberg. You shouldn't touch, Jean. You shouldn't touch. She's on the fourth floor. The third shelf, that's Mrs. Cohen's shelf. No, can't touch. And so it went that my grandmother had one shelf only of the refrigerator. It was a very heady time to be in Israel. Things were happening just on a huge, massive scale. For example, every day in the newspaper, there would be at least one word, sometimes more than one word, that would be a new invention because it's something that wasn't in biblical Hebrew. And they needed words like for airplane and other things that weren't in the Bible time. Anyway, I was in B'nai Brak with my grandparents, and constantly people would come to visit. And I soon realized they were coming to look me over to see who I should go out with. And every Saturday night, right as soon as Shabbos was over, and my grandmother would look outside to see if she would see the 3 stars, and with her eyesight, it could have been midnight, she wouldn't see 3 stars. And I'd say to her, yes, Grandma, there are 3 stars in the sky. There'd be a knock on the door, and it would be some yeshiva bocher that Grandma had arranged to come over to meet me. Well, this went on for a little while, and it was not something that I really enjoyed very much. And finally I decided if I wanted to stay in Israel, I really had to learn Hebrew. And I couldn't get a job without learning Hebrew. And I better get out of B'nai Brak. So I had heard about the Jewish agency starting an ulpan to be called an Anglo-Saxon ulpan. It was a first. They wanted an ulpan with all people who spoke English. They wanted it to be people who spoke English as a common language. And it was to be on kibbutz Ma'aleh HaChamisha in the Jerusalem corridor. I thought that sounded pretty good, and I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, but I knew that I could go to this Ulpan and I would get 4 hours of learning for 4 hours of work. And that sounded like a pretty good deal to me, plus all my meals. So I went to Ma'aleh HaChamisha, and it's a magnificent, magnificently wonderful kibbutz overlooking Abu Ghosh. In later years, I've been back to Ma'aleh HaChamisha at Abu Ghosh, and it's quite amazing how they've grown. Ma'aleh HaChamisha had at that time, and still has, a guest house. My son Jonathan has stayed at the guest house with groups that he has led many times. So I've had a chance to go back to Ma'aleh HaChamisha, and anyway, we lived, it was a kibbutz in those days, absolutely a communal settlement. The parents lived separately from their children, who lived in children's houses. I began to see how this could be okay. When the parents were free with their children, they didn't have to worry about learning, making dinner, doing laundry, doing any of the millions of things that American mothers have to worry about, because all that was done for them. There was a kibbutz laundry, a dining room, everything was done. So they could just play with their children and really, really enjoy their children. In those days, it was still a very idealistic movement, which, as you know, now has kind of sputtered to close to an end. I was impressed with the kibbutz. We were each paired with someone, and we worked. We did different kinds of work. I remember being paired with a woman who was in charge of the children's houses, and every day she would make me scrub the stone steps to the children's house. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, the steps were clean, but I had to scrub them every single day. And so I didn't really like that. I also worked in the kitchen and used to be very upset when I would see them making soup, vegetable soup, and all the cooked carrots and celery and potatoes, all of this thrown out. And I try to say to them that in America we ate that kind of stuff. We don't eat it here. Everything was still very much as it had been in the old country. The people on the kibbutz who had started it were a group of Polish young people who had gotten together, and they had gotten out of Poland before the war. Most of them had no families because their families thought they were crazy going to the Promised Land. And so they became like families to each other. I became particularly fond of my teacher, David Rohn, and found that he was a wonderful, wonderful teacher. And he used to say, "I'm not surprised about any of these people being here except you, Jean, because I didn't know that there were Jews in Nebraska." And most people, at that time, the stage show Oklahoma was popular, and many people thought I was from Oklahoma. Now, of course, in Israel, as of my most recent trip, all you have to do is say that you're from where Warren Buffett lives, and they all say, "Aha, we know Warren Buffett," because, as you know, he bought a big part of he bought all of an Israeli company. Anyway, I stayed on the kibbutz. for almost 6 months. I had very, very interesting roommates. One was a girl from Australia, one was a girl from New Zealand, and another, a nurse from New York. And we were all very fond of one another. And we actually stayed in contact for quite a few years, though I'm sorry to say I have lost contact since then. I also stayed in contact with my teacher, and when I was there, we did take a trip in December down to the Negev. Eilat really wasn't, and Beersheba was just a beginning of a town. We went as far as Beersheba, and there was no road any farther. Even the road to Beersheba was not a real road. But our teacher kept saying, someday this will be a major town. You won't believe it. This will be major, major. Well, of course, now the roads go far past Beersheba. They go down to Eilat, and Beersheba has a major hospital, a major university. It's a big town. But in those days, we really couldn't believe it when we were told that it would be. So I really saw the growth of many of these towns in Israel. My sister Doris and her husband Marty Haken were expecting their first child. And my mother had come to Israel to visit with her parents and to see me, and then Mother and I were to go back through Europe to get home in time for the birth of Doris's first child. So at that point I had been offered several jobs, but I had met my husband-to-be and wished to come back to America to pursue that. It was good that I did. Doris had her son towards the end of June. Jack and I reunited, and I realized that that's who I wanted to marry. Neither of us should have been surprised that some of our children ended up in Israel. When my mother, in later years, I think it was like about 1975, I can't quite remember, decided she wanted to buy an apartment in Jerusalem. And she knew the neighborhood she wanted to move into, and she walked up and down the streets. In those days, there were pieces of paper tacked to trees that told about apartments that were for rent or for sale. And Mother found an apartment at 19 Ben Maimon. That was a beautiful, beautiful area in Rehavia at that point. There was like a garden walkway with the most the most beautiful roses. And Mother bought an apartment at 19 Ben Maimon. Well, that proved to be the place that all the children went to when they were in college. David spent his first year at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I don't know why I paid for a dormitory room for him, because he stayed at my mother's apartment. Later, Debbie went, as did Jonathan. They got plenty of use out of that apartment. There was a neighbor who lived below my mother, and she would send my mother notes. People still didn't call in those days. She would send my mother notes about what was going on in her apartment. And I remember one note that she wrote that said, "Your grandson has the most colorful clothes I have ever seen. And as they hang out on the line flapping, I hope that he washed them first." Anyway, it was very nice having her there. And she was there for many years before she became ill and died. David is our oldest. David married Susan Wintrobe, Dick and Davy Wintrobe's son, and Sid and Pin Wintrobe's granddaughter. That was perhaps the happiest moment of my mother and Sid Wintrobe's life, that their grandchildren should marry each other, and they had been very close friends for so many years. They were a wonderful pair, the two of them, and I still remember the only argument that they ever had when David and Susie had their first child, Rachel. My mother decided she wanted to make Rachel a life member of Hadassah. Well, who do you think was in charge of life memberships but Sid Wintrobe? And she called Sid and said, I want to make Rachel a life member of Hadassah. And Sid said, oh no, I want to make Rachel a life member of Hadassah. And I mean, the child wasn't even 24 hours old yet. Well, finally, they decided they would each pay half of a life membership. And so Rachel, I don't know if you know it or not, but you've been a life member of Hadassah since you were born. Their other child is Adam Richard, named after his grandfather, Dick Wintrobe. And David and his family now live in the Washington, D.C. area. David is in the television business. Our second child is Debbie, who married Avram Brickner, and they have 3 children. Their oldest child is Gershie. Gershie is 13 years old now, and they have twins, Nakama and Yehudit, who are 11. Jonathan, who got married earlier than Debbie, has 3 children. His children are Rob, who is 18, and who may be going into the Israel Army very soon. Nadiv, who is 16, and Naomi, who is 14. They have lived in Israel for all their life. The kids are all Sabras, but I'm very happy that they speak an excellent English, so we are able to communicate. My daughter-in-law, Lori, is from L.A., and she came to Israel when she was a sophomore in high school and went to a program at Kfar Bloom to learn Hebrew and Hebrew grammar and everything. She liked Kfar Bloom so much that she got her parents to allow her to stay there the following year when she had to be in a regular school, and she was able to do it. So her Hebrew is absolutely excellent, and she has been able to teach college courses in Hebrew, and she's very, very good in that. Lori has a master's degree as a dietitian, and for some years was the only full-fledged dietitian that we knew of in Israel. Israel doesn't change quite quickly as other places do, and a dietitian in a Hadassah hospital there is basically a little more than a head cook. So that is not really quite what my daughter-in-law planned for. She was the head dietitian at the Hadassah Hospital on Scopus for, I think, 16 years. No, maybe not 16. Maybe 12 years? I can't quite remember. Anyway, and now she does private counseling in nutrition, and but keeps very busy with being in charge of the Vaad Habayit of the building where they live. They now live at 40 Ramban, which is a big building, and Lori handles all the duties of the Vad Habayit, and that includes how much everyone owes for gas, depending, of course, on the time of year, how much everybody owes for electricity, and the general maintenance, because there is a man who comes in every Friday morning and he scrubs all the steps, and a gardener and all the rest. Lori does that, and I think it's fantastic that she does, but there are always knocks on the door at odd hours. Oh, we're locked out or something, you know. But anyway, that's Lori. Debbie, I didn't say anything much about Jonathan. Jonathan did a lot of different things for a while, but finally decided that he could go to Israeli tour guide school. And being an Israeli tour guide is a very, very great thing for him because he loves the country, and he really knows it from walking so much of it. To be a tour guide, you have to go to school for 2 years and know about botany and history and Zionism and a million different things. As Jonathan says, be sure there'll be somebody on your tour who will try to trip you up. He will think maybe you don't know what that rock formation is over there. But it has been a very good match for him. He has gone to Poland about 44 times at this point. He takes the March of the Living. He is always engaged with the Canadian government and takes a Canadian group on the March of the Living. He also takes Canadian groups on Birthright, and he'll take other groups too, but because they use him so much, the Canadian government has kind of first call on him. He works for himself, and he does a wonderful job. And I'm not saying that because I'm his mother. I'm saying that because I have read many of the letters that come to him afterwards, and they all tell him how he was a main influence in their life. And many of these kids that he leads come back in later years to live in Israel. It's a really great thing that he does. Let's go back to, we'll talk about David. His wife, Susie, is a banker in D.C., and then we come to Debbie, and Debbie is a physician. She is a child and adolescent psychiatrist. She went to the Med Center here in Omaha, and then followed at Cleveland Children's Hospital, and then went to Mass General for her fellowship. She was affiliated with Mass General for several years. She's married to Avram Bruckner, and their first child, Gershie, was diagnosed with Canavan disease when he was about 3 months old. However, Debbie, being a physician, knew that things weren't quite normal with him. Quite early on, she knew that. Jack and I really didn't know until he was about 3 months old, and we were in Boston, and then we realized there was something quite drastically wrong with him. Now, Debbie had had all the prenatal tests, and she knew she wasn't a Tay-Sachs carrier, and she knew she wasn't a lot of different things, but she had never heard of Canavan disease, nor had her doctor, and the test was not so readily available at that time. I'm happy to say that since that time, Canavan disease has become known as one of the big 7 Jewish genetic diseases. And Debbie and her husband and I have long advocated for pre-marriage testing. The Orthodox community handles this in a very nice way. They test young people at the age of about 18, and they keep it in their files and don't tell the people if they are carriers of anything. But then when the time comes that a girl and boy find each other, then they call up this company. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name right now, and give them their names and their numbers, and they look up to see whether they are compatible genetically. If both are carriers for a disease, they will tell them that their chances are, in general, 1 in 4, that they will have a child with the disease. 2 in 4, that their child will be a carrier, and 1 in 4, that the child will be normal. Well, none of that was really known very much at that time. But anyway, Gershie has Canavan disease, and he has never walked or talked or crawled, but he has the most beautiful and meaningful smile. And he is a lovely, lovely child. Debbie and her husband, Avi, were very thrilled when he turned 13 that they were able to have a bar mitzvah for him. They had it on a Thursday, and Avi read the prayers into a tape recorder, and then they put a headpiece on Gershie with rather a long pointer, and they indicated to him that he needed to move his head down to put it on the tape recorder. So you heard, it wasn't Gershie, it was his father, but he was there, and he had a tallis, and it was a great, great simcha. My son David came in for it. I was there, and Avi had several members of his family come in from the East Coast. Gershie, we don't know what his lifespan will be. He's already lived much longer than we ever thought he would. But they persist in giving him excellent care. He recently had a fundo operation, and it seems a little bit easier to care for him now. He's a wonderful child, and he has such a smile and such a grin, and he loves to be at the table when the motzi is said, and he tries to vocalize a little bit. Debbie and her husband also have twin daughters, Nechama and Yehudit. These girls are red-haired like my grandma Libalea Katz, blue-eyed like my grandmother Libalea Katz and like I am, and they are a house of fire. They made Aliyah to Israel 2 years ago, and this past Passover moved into their new home there. They bought a place in Arnona, which used to be very much of a suburb of Jerusalem. But now you really can't tell where one leaves off and the other begins. The girls stay at their same school, which is Evelina, and they take the school bus to Evelina every day. Gershie is at a very, very wonderful and special yeshiva, and the driver comes for Gershie every morning, delivers him to his classroom, and then brings him back home in the afternoon. I've seen the teachers in Gershie's school, and I cannot tell you how wonderful they are. They treat each child wonderfly. Gershie, the last time I visited, was in a class of about 8. They have at least one helper for each child. Many of the children are much more active than Gershie, but they all have very, very major problems. We understand there is quite a bit of Canavan disease in Israel, but people do not seem to keep their children at home. They seem to send them to orphanages. At least this is the perception that I got. I think it's time now to move on to after Jack and I were married. I'd like to talk about Jack now. Jack and I were married on November 28th, 1954, at where else? Bethel Synagogue in Omaha, Nebraska. Everything important in my life happened at Bethel Synagogue. My 2 older sisters and I were married there. My parents were buried from there. All my children had their B'nai Mitzvah there. So Bethel was really interwoven into our life very much. At one time, Jack headed the maintenance committee at Bethel, and he would go there. Jack was an early riser, and he would go there every morning just to see that everything was okay. And if the weather was bad, he'd make sure that the area was plowed. He was truly, truly very, very devoted to Bethel. And he and Lucy were big buds. I think it was probably his devotion to Bethel that led him to be asked to be on the library committee of the Jewish Federation. He served on the board for several years, I can't remember how many, and then he was chairman for several years. He really adored the library, and that was just a fine place for him because Jack always had his nose stuck in a book. So this was really very, very good. In later years, when he was a resident of the Blumkin home, we would often wheel him over to the library so he could see how much it had expanded. Jack did a lot of interesting things. When I first married him, he was a copywriter for a company in Chicago, and we lived in Chicago. We had been married maybe about a year when my mother came to us and asked if Jack would like to go into Levinson's, the family business, which at that time had a pest control side and a janitorial supply side. And Jack said, well, he might be very interested in doing this. He didn't know. Jack was always very smart. He was a Phi Beta Kappa, and he just soaked up knowledge. Mother said to him, every year there is a program at the University of Illinois, and they talk about pest control. It's just pest control people. And either you, about the business side, or you could go to Purdue University in Indiana. Purdue has a program on the technical side of pest control. And so Jack thought, well, he'd go to Purdue and he'd just see what it was like. Well, when he came home, I shall never forget, he said, Jean, I couldn't believe about it. We'd be sitting at the table and someone would talk about a rat that they caught that was in a funny place. These are things we never talked about in our house. And I said, but I grew up hearing all this stuff about bugs and everything. By the way, my father had white mice that we kept at our house. And so, I mean, I grew up hearing about bugs and rodents and everything. But in any case, Jack and I decided that it would be a better life to come to Omaha, where I had family. And my sister Doris and her husband Marty lived here with, I don't know how many children they had at the time. They had two, I think. And Marty was in, he was either in pre-med or med school. He went to Creighton Medical School. Anyway, so we came back to Omaha. And Jack was really very involved in the community. He belonged to the Rotary group. He belonged to all kinds of different groups. His particular love was Jewish camping. That he adored. And many of the committee he sat on with Sherman Pasca to talk about Jewish camping in Omaha. He was among the few who had picked out the site of the JCC camp. I remember we went with Norman and Frances Batt to look at this piece of land. It looked like nothing much at that time, but it became Camp JCC. Later, Jack sadly knew that it was time for the community to give up their camp because the attendance just wasn't what it should have been. But he was always on the scholarship committee at Bethel and would make sure that anyone who needed a scholarship to go to a Jewish camp could get one. He was very good at attracting money and had a couple loyal people who always said to him, anybody that you think deserves a scholarship, we will give money to. And many of the time that Jack tapped them and said, we really need to send so-and-so to camp. He was particularly fond of sending kids to Camp Herzl. Camp Ramad kind of interested a different kind of a person a little bit more serious. I had incidentally gone to Herzl Camp the year before I was a senior in high school when my mother was in charge of the Omaha Zionist Youth Commission. And that was a group that saw to it that young people learned about Zionism, went to Jewish camps, and Mother had organized a great number of young Judea clubs, and there were young Judea clubs and senior Judea clubs. And when camps came up, of course, who would Mother send to investigate a camp but her own kids? Doris went to Camp Masada, which was a Hebrew-speaking camp in the East, and I was sent then a couple of years later to Herzl to see what was going on there. I had a wonderful, wonderful experience at Herzl Camp, and I know that many young people are still going there. One of my mother's greatest accomplishments was sending an entire train load of kids to Herzl. They reserved one whole car on a train going to Minneapolis. That was at the height of Herzl Camp and Omaha's relationship. I later sent my children, who loved it very much, but Debbie had been influenced to go to Camp Ramah, and so she went, in addition to Herzl, she went to Camp Ramah. And it's interesting because she went to a Ramah reunion very, very recently and saw a lot of the kids that she had known in high school. But Jack grew to love this community, and although he made frequent trips back to Spokane, where his family was, and he loved Spokane, and I grew to love Spokane, but it was like a totally different experience between Spokane and Omaha. But Jack's involvement was great. One year, when Mort Greenberg was here as head of the Federation, he called me and asked me if I thought Jack and I would like to chair a program on Israel. I thought we might want to do it. I didn't have any idea what was entailed, but he knew that there were several Israelis who were sort of on the circuit and would come into Omaha if we put on a program. So we did, and we worked very, very hard, and we sure found out who the loyal Zionists of Omaha were. And we put on a program called Israel and You. I shall never forget it, because many of the people who were our guests at that time became major political people in Israel. And I could honestly say I knew them when. Anyway, that was very successful. I later was the chairman of the Women's Division State of Israel bonds, and I at that time raised a record amount for Israel bonds. They no longer have this in Omaha because the men and women's bonds are together now. I was always very involved doing something at Bethel, whether it was the school board or as an officer or as just anything at Bethel. Anything but baking, which was never my forte. And our kids loved Bethel, and I must say that my mother, living next door to the old building, was certainly partly responsible for it, plus Mother had a color TV. And when David would read Torah at Bethel, then he could come over to Mother's for lunch and to watch a football game in color. So that was quite an incentive. I could tell you a lot about our different activities in Omaha, but I guess none of it really is important now, except I think the work I did on Jewish genetic testing, that was important, and that will have a lasting effect, because we did test 107 people for 8 Jewish genetic diseases, and we were amazed, although we shouldn't have been. But our local record was 1 in 4 people we tested were carriers. And this was just shocking. I don't know why, because that's what it is nationally. But these were people, many of them who came for the testing because they didn't want to let me down, but they never thought that they would be carriers of anything. But they found out that they were, and that it has become very real to them. I'm happy to say that my good friend Joni Jacobson is going to continue the testing program, and in a short time you'll be hearing more about it. I'd like to close this by saying I love you very much, to my 3 children and their spouses, David and Susan, Debbie and Avi, and Jonathan and Lori, and my grandchildren, Rachel and Adam Duitch, Mayrav, Nadiv, and Nomi Duitch, and Gershi Brickner, and Nakama and Yehudit Brickner. I love you all very, very much.